Hello, we are the Ministry of the Real Truth. We have had a few comments suggesting that we don't have the original Hebrew text or know of them. That is the original ancient, very old Hebrew text, the Lashon HaKodesh. So we decided on seeking them out, as we, the Ministry of the Real Truth, will have access to the said original ancient, very old, sacred, scribal, old tongue or language, the Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah, aka the said language of God that God spoke, that He spoke to men, and so forth, of the original ancient, very old Ktav Ivri or Avri, the sister language of the said original ancient, very old Ktav Ivri, Avri or Hotep, or the original ancient, very old Hebrew. We found these in great number. Video lessons about the Lashon HaKodesh, and we watched this first one here a little bit, and it's pretty interesting, the comparisons between the Lashon HaKodesh and the Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah. This is of the Hebrew. Lashon HaKodesh is supposed to be the original, as it states here, God's language and His holy tongue, compared with the said original ancient, very old Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah of the Aramaic, the Ktav Ivri or Avri, which is supposed to be the older sister language of the Hebrew. This one is saying originally the Hebrew was the language of God, whereas the translated Victor Alexander says no, the Aramaic was. So there's that difference there, right? But we have found through our personal research, etc., that apparently they were the same languages, right? They had the same words with the same meanings, but at some point, maybe when the Hebrew was modernized or modified, at some ancient era or age, and this dot system was added, etc., maybe the Masoretes or whoever did this, that the words, that the language, the actual structure of the language not only was changed, but the meaning of the words also changed. So originally we had the Aramaic and the Hebrew, the ancient Hebrew. It had the same words with the same meanings. When modified or modernized, then it not only changes the structure but also changed the meaning of the words. So now they have similar words but with different meanings. Example, Yuma, which means immeasurable period, unfathomable period. That's when nobody knows, because there's nobody there. When did God start the creating act, and when did He finish? Okay? There's no human beings around at that time to note it orally or eventually write it down. Okay, we'll write it down in that period. So we're going to make a comparison of these two different claims, one from the ancient original Aramaic, Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah, Ktav Ivri, and the other on the supposedly ancient Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, because we want to see where the similarities are, if there are similarities, or if there's a completely different interpretation, understanding, etc. Hopefully you understand where we're coming from. We may have to do a second or third part, because the information we were finding, trying to refine in regards to the ancient Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah, the Ktav Ivri, from this translator's website that was down, but we resurrected it, etc., etc., may prove elusive at this point, right? So bear with us. Okay, so we're going to listen to this rabbi here and see what he has to say about the Lashon HaKodesh, and then we'll present you the Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah from the native-born Aramaic speaking translator Victor in Alexander. He's fluent in English and also Aramaic. He might know Persian and something else, as we just found on his website. And it was down, and we resurrected it.
Holy tongue. So the question is, why is the Hebrew language referred?
Okay, I'll go back.
The Hebrew language is referred to as the holy tongue. In Hebrew, it's called Lashon HaKodesh. The holy tongue. So the question is, why is the Hebrew language referred to as the holy tongue? Our language are not in any way ever have any relevance to the holy tongue. So Nachmanides, Ramban writes in his introduction that because the Hebrew language...
Okay, we're going to go back, see if we can use the subtitles here. They're not always accurate, and so you can actually hear and see what he supposedly says and narrate on that if there's any discrepancies or whatever that we have in our head.
The Hebrew language is referred to as the holy tongue. In Hebrew, it's called Lashon HaKodesh. The holy tongue. So the question is, why is the Hebrew language referred to as the holy tongue? Our language are not in any way ever have any relevance to the holy tongue. So Nachmanides, Ramban writes in his introduction that
we have to go back and look at that because subtitles give us the wrong
Hebrew language is referred to as the holy tongue.
Okay, so the Hebrew language is referred to as the holy tongue.
In Hebrew, it's called Lashon HaKodesh.
In Hebrew, it's called Lashon HaKodesh.
The holy tongue. So the question is, why?
The holy tongue. So the question is, why?
Is the Hebrew language referred to as the holy tongue? Our language are not.
Okay, so why is it referred to as the holy language or referred to as the holy tongue? And that should be in their language. It sounds like it should be in their language.
In any way, ever, have any relevance to the holy tongue.
Okay, maybe he's saying something like any other language that claims that it's the holy tongue has no relevance to the actual holy tongue. We're not too sure because these subtitles are misleading, because they hear it wrong or whatever that system does.
So Nachmanides, Ramban writes in his introduction.
So they always refer to some older or ancient rabbi that left his writings, had his ideas, maybe he passed, right? They always seem to refer back to a rabbi.
That because the Hebrew language is God's language.
Okay, so he's saying the Hebrew language is God's language, it's the language that God spoke, that he spoke to Adam, and then he spoke to those men who gathered as one in the desert region of Sumer or Shi'nar and built that ziggurat or Tower of Babel, and they spoke to each other using that one language, the language of God that he spoke to Adam and Eve, and then spoke, gave it to them, and they spoke to each other using that particular language.
And God is the source of everything, all holiness. So because this is his language, therefore it's referred to as the holy tongue.
Okay, so he's basically saying because that Hebrew is the holy language of God,
God, anything God is associated with is holy. The land of Israel is called the Holy Land because that's where his presence is.
Okay, so some would argue, then with an argument, okay, how come they started this, they bombed Palestine, they did all this sort of supposedly horrific stuff. Okay, that's from one person's point of view, perhaps a conspiracy theorist or someone that's in Arabic or Islamic or whatever, living in that Palestinian region. Okay, that's their perspective. Okay, we only know of what other people relate to us. Oh, look what they did to these people. Here, raise some money, help us to raise some money to help those poor victims, all that sort of stuff, right? So we're getting it second hand, aren't we? Okay.
Therefore, it's referred to as the holy tongue. The first language of humanity was the Hebrew language.
Okay, so from his mouth, he states the first language of humanity was the Hebrew language, whereas we have a comparative view which says something completely different from an Aramaic, native-born Aramaic-speaking translator from Bet Narain, Mesopotamia, where all this sort of thing supposedly came from, and so forth.
We read in the Torah about the building of the Tower of Babel.
Okay, so this is the book of instruction, or as Western people or whoever call it, the book of the law. Okay, and a lot stress that you must follow that. If not, you're in big trouble.
When the 70 root families had gotten together and they tried to launch a
okay, so 70 root families, that's according to the Torah or the book of instruction, whereas you have your modern Americanized Bible versions, which would just basically say in English, all men gathered unto one place, and they spoke one language, and they all decided to build this tower. They decided amongst themselves, let's call ourselves a nation so we won't ever be scattered, speaking one language and all this sort of stuff. So they were all united in this one purpose, whatever that was, whether it's good or totally evil. Some myths go they try to build a tower to overthrow the gods and all this sort of stuff, right? And so forth.
Against God, and they were going to build this tower and rebel against God through this tower. The 70 root nations. And the Torah goes out of its way to tell us what unified them, because they were of common language. Since they spoke one language, therefore, that was the basis for their unification. That's why there was such a cohesive group, that they were bent, all in agreement, we have to rebel against God. What is God?
So there was these people in the desert region of Sumer or Shi'nar, okay, all gathered together as one, united and spoke one language. Sumer, which is like part of Syria or a region in Syria or Assyria at that time, but the Assyrians hadn't gathered together and invaded it yet. Right, and these people were like scattered by God apparently, and then inhabited the rest of the earth. So obviously there were no Sumerians in that desert region at the time. Be a desert region, what do you expect, right? So there was no one there to be called the Sumerians, even though it was called the land of Sumer.
And he evaluates the situation and he disperses them. The 70 nations were dispersed. And as a result...
Okay, that should be 17 nations. It's these silly subtitles. 1 minute say 17, next minute say 17. It's because it's hearing it, right? It's not translating it accurately. Well, it can't, by the look of it.
So this dispersion, the project stopped. How did he stop the project? So the Midrash tells us that initially they were able to communicate with one another, and because they all spoke the same language, and that's what unified them. So God confused their language. He confused their language. Each person, each one of these families assumed another language, and they weren't able to communicate with one another.
Okay, we have come across some claims, like especially with the Mormons, that there was a certain family there that when this Tower of Babel work was stopped and people were scattered everywhere, that a certain family of this group had these writings or something like that, and they went somewhere else, and then they eventually ended up sailing away and going to the land of America and started up argument apparently with the native Indians or whatever. Then they come to some sort of agreement according to this Latter-day Saint book of Mormon, right, with this whatever's in there, right? And it was the start of the Mormonism movement before Joseph Smith discovered the golden tablets or copper tablets or whatever they were in a certain area in America, and then created that Mormon church. And also that of late there's some Nigerian supposed apostle or prophet, self-claimed whatever, on the point of saying he's a son of God or a child of God in that sense, but he's hinting at that he's also the Son of God, Jesus the Christ, right? Be careful of that one. Saying that everybody spoke this one language, but when they were dispersed, they spoke different languages, but this one particular group, according to his claims, still spoke that, kept it, right? And he's basically translated into English, started up a, you could say, a following or a cult, depends on how you perceive it, that when translated, we're doing a recall here, he states that the baptism, John the Baptist's form of baptism and Christ's baptism was all wrong. People today who get baptized are doing it all wrong, because he reckons he had a revelation from God that he had to go out in the outpouring of rain in his country, probably Nigeria or somewhere like that, where he is from, and get totally soaking wet, and that was the baptism, that was the correct baptism and all this other stuff. And then all these African Americans, or these Negroes in America, right, seem to think he's the prophet, so they latch onto his teachings, etc., and so forth, and it looks like they were educating their children on it with the different videos and stuff, pictures, images. But he states on his website that we found, you can't be part of his group because you're not pure African. You're a half-breed. You're a mixture of European, or whatever, and African. You're not a pure-breed. So sorry, you can't be part of the group. But they still come out and say, oh, this guy, he's the prophet, and you don't know this, you don't know that. You don't have the Torah. They've put an H there, right? Or it's supposed to be the Torah, right? Well, we found it. Yeah, it's basically that. They've just put an H there. Maybe they might say, well, I don't think this particular group did, but you're not of that colour, of that race, you're excluded, it's not for you, etc., etc. You don't know this, you don't know that, you're not included, whatever, right? They come up through the comments, stuff like that, or whatever we see in their videos. Okay, so you've got to be careful of that one. And of course there'll be others that are making these claims that they are the true Jews, they have the evidence, and God's name is Yahoo Wahoo Wahoo, Yahoo Woo Woo Woo, whatever they come up with, Yahoo Washi Washi, when it's not, because we asked a professor with 2 doctorates, 2 PhDs in the Hebrew and the Aramaic. These people are claiming that Solomon was black, God's black, Jesus black, everybody in the Bible is black, and that these are the names of God. And he says, what? He thought I was playing games, so he got a bit anti there, right? And he said, no, this is, I'm for real, so I'm asking this question, right? And he must have calmed down, and he said, that's a load of rubbish, that's not his name, it's not even Hebrew, okay? Yahoo Wahi Wahi Washi Washi Woo Woo, whatever, that's a load of rubbish, okay? So it sounds like they're making it up, okay? And then they're claiming that they have this, or something like this, but they may have been referring to this, claiming it as theirs, okay, not belonging to these Jewish people, okay, because they're not the true Jews or this sort of stuff, but they are, right? But we haven't gone further into that in that regard, right? Okay, so we'll go back to this guy, this rabbi.
And because there was a lack of communication, that brought the project to a halt, because there was no communication. So initially, What caused the unification? Same language. What disrupted it was there's no communication, because now is the beginning of the 70 languages, which the 70 families are identified as the root nations of existence. This is when they took on that status of root nations. Each nation has its own language.
Okay, yeah, we understand this guy. Yes, Rabbi, right? Yep. A lot of it, what he's saying, is actually in the Aramaic Brita, or Genesis in English, right? Of that Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah, the Ktav Ivri, and also the modern Bible versions, the Americanized English Bible versions. It's basically saying the same thing. So all good with that so far.
So when they speak about language developing over centuries or millennia...
Sorry, we forgot to add that, because that's the genealogy in the Bible, right, where Noah steps out of the ark with his 3 sons, and his Noah steps out of the ark with his wife, his 3 sons and their 3 wives, okay, and then they go off and they have their own sons and daughters, descendants, right, Noah's descendants, and they split into these different groups, and it actually tells you there these are the descendants of Shem or Cam or Japheth, etc., right? And it says the Ashkenazis, Magog, Mithraim, etc., and it tells you, what we found with the Aramaic translation is underneath there's always these footnotes, right? And it explains to you, okay, the Anglo-Saxons, the Medes, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and so forth, right? So, like you said, these 70 families that's, split off, and they each had their own language, so we agree with that.
They develop with other words refinement, but the root, the basis for language, every one of the 70 language, this is something God put in their minds and embedded in their psyche, in their mental state, their intellect, that they speak differently. They speak a different language, and they couldn't communicate. And Rashi cites the Midrash. One person asked for an axe, the other person asked for a pail, and because they couldn't understand one another, there was a level of frustration, they began killing one another. And therefore, that brought it to a halt. So I asked the question. People are not able to verbally communicate, but through motions, hand motions, facial motions, pointing to certain things, you're able to communicate. Language is not the barrier. People overcome the barrier of language. If people are bent that they want to rebel against God to that point, how is because they can't communicate verbally, although they could communicate other ways, that somehow brought it to an end. To the point that there was a level of frustration that it was disrupted because there was internal fighting. Why? Okay? So there's a question which is asked. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, is the one who destroyed the first temple. And the Jews were exiled to Babylon. We spent 70 years there.
So this king that arose, would he have been Nimrod? Or this king who arose decided, because the Tower of Babel, before the Tower of Babel, apparently Cain built cities, or villages or cities or something like that, according to Genesis. So then they got to that point where they actually built structures, towns, kingdoms, right? So would Nimrod have been that first king to do that, as he possibly mentions, right? And then Babylon, as he said, the king of Babylon forces these people to be slaves of it. I'm pretty sure that's what he said. We go back a bit.
Destroyed the first temple. And the Jews were exiled to Babylon.
Oh, okay, later on, yeah, okay.
We spent 70 years there. So the prophet says that because you destroyed my temple and you exiled my children, and the Talmud quotes a verse that because you did that, you will not have a descendant to continue your line.
Ah, okay.
You will not have a language any longer. The Babylonian language will come to an end. So who is the end of the line of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor? Vashti, the story of Purim, who was the queen of Achashverosh, who was the Persian emperor, who reigned the world supreme. She was the last descendant of Achashverosh. And we know the story. Achashverosh, on the 7th day of his celebration of his inauguration of king, he made a request of his wife to come. She spoke disrespectfully to him. And what did he do? He had her killed. That was the end of the line. When Achashverosh killed Vashti, that was a fulfillment of what God said through the prophet, your line will come to an end. What about the language coming to an end? So you say, well, people don't no longer speak Babylonian. So the commentators ask, this is the year 1050, 1100. People still speak Babylonian. So if they still speak Babylonian, that part of the prophecy was never fulfilled. But the Talmud says it came to an end. Where did it come to an end? So
okay. So if that prophecy never became fulfilled, okay, it never came about, then there's a problem there, isn't there? Okay, there's the truth then that a lot of the prophecies made didn't come true. You understand? Okay, so we're trying to figure out who this king was. Was it Nimrod or was it somebody else prior to him? Because Nimrod became powerful, etc., etc., according to the Bible. Apparently he had a wife, but Nimrod died and she was found to be pregnant, or she was boasting that she was pregnant. So the story goes, as far as we know, that it's the reincarnation of Nimrod, and this went on to become possibly the Horus Osiris, related to that, right? That her husband was, or that king was killed by his brother Set, or something like that, thrown into the Nile where the crocodiles ate all of him, but she managed to grab the pieces, put it back together, but she couldn't find his phallus, so she created this wooden one, all that sort of stuff, and then apparently had a child to him and all this sort of stuff, which was the Horus or something like that, right? As far as those myths go, all that sort of stuff. It sounds very relatable to Nimrod, maybe Semiramis or whoever his wife was, okay? But she did apparently boast that she had this child, she was pregnant to that dead king, and he was the reincarnation of Nimrod. So we'll carry on.
One of the commentators answers that it's not referring to the Babylonian language, but rather it's referring to, there was a dialect that was spoken only by the royalty of Babylon. That dialect will become forgotten, but the language remains in place, the vernacular which the commoner speaks.
It's a modern language, it's a modern derivative of it, right?
That language will continue to be spoken. However,
or a new version of that old language. Right? That one died, but there was a new one that came along, and the people, common people, everyday people spoke that one.
The Maharal of Prague explains it differently. He explains it differently. He explains, he says, if a Persian speaks Babylonian, does that make him a Babylonian? He speaks the language. What is language? Language is a representation of a culture. That's what language is. The Persians have their culture, however, it's expressed through the Persian language. The Babylonians have their unique culture.
That should be the Babylonians, not the Labylonians. It sounds like an Italian sausage.
It's expressed through Babylonian. The French have their culture. They express it through French. The English, the British have theirs. It's expressed through English language. So what is language? Language is an expression of the profile of that particular group. Whether you're Frenchman, Englishman, we're talking about it's a different personality. It's a different perspective. When people have two perspectives, you can't have meetings in the mind. The French and the English can never see eye to eye. Why can't they see eye to eye? Because they speak different language, or because the whole mentality, the perspectives is different perspective. So language is only indication the perspective is different perspective.
Could that also be why males can never truly understand the female mind, because it's completely different? Could it be something like that along those lines? Who knows?
Well, God disrupted this project, this rebellion, this mutiny against him, when he created 70 languages. The language is only an indication of the perspective became a different perspective. Initially, when they spoke the same language, that indicated they had a similar, almost identical perspective. We all have meeting in the minds because we see things similarly. But now,
that's when you're one in agreement, right? You're communicating. Okay, you got the same mindset or understanding, right? You're agreeing with each other. Is that what it's referring to?
that God gave each one another language, and language is an expression of that ethnic group or that culture, we see things differently. We can't agree on anything. As a result of that, when it says one asked for this, one asked for that, they became frustrated. They started to kill one another. It's not because they couldn't communicate. They could communicate. But the communication initially, which was embraced and valued, they can't agree on anything. Because they couldn't agree on anything. And what was the proof that the perspective changed is because they each one had his own language.
Isn't that because of division? That division that was created, that separation, that differentiation, or that differentiation, or that difference, i.e., they were given different languages, so this one could no longer understand what that one was saying. As he said, pass the bucket, this guy goes and gives him a hammer. Right? No, he said, I said bucket, and he gives him a hammer, right? Or gives him a shovel. So this other guy gets frustrated, grabs the shovel and smacks him on the head with it. Is that what he's trying to get at?
Language is an expression of the perspective of the culture. That's the understanding.
But like cultures, language evolves over time. So that's possibly why they end up losing the old language, right? That dies out, and then this, but they create this, or manage to create this modern vernacular, or this new vernacular of it, right? And speak that new language.
So initially, so that is the meaning what the prophet said, that because he destroyed the temple, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, the language will be forgotten. Meaning that perspective, which represents the Babylonian perspective, will come to an end. That perspective that will no longer exist. So anybody who speaks Babylonian, it's no longer expressing the Babylonian perspective, but rather it's a Persian perspective expressed through the Babylonian language. It's like if a person speaks Farsi, it doesn't make him into a Persian. He could be an American, except he's bilingual, trilingual, how many languages he knows. He speaks the language, but that has nothing to do with who he himself is. So according to this principle, when God originally created the world, I was saying the Hebrew language is called Lashon HaKodesh. It's the Hebrew tongue.
Ignore that, Los Angeles. It's a silly subtitles putting up the wrong. Hears it wrong, so it puts up the wrong words. Nothing to do with Los Angeles. He's talking about the Lashon HaKodesh.
Because it's God's language. So if all humanity initially, before there was this presentation of languages, which disrupted the mutiny with the Tower of Babel, what does that mean? If they all spoke the same language. All speaking the same language means they have a similar perspective. And so if all humanity spoke the Hebrew language, the holy tongue, what does that mean? That means that perspective is rooted and some degree of holiness. Because if language is an expression of God, and that displays some aspect of God's godliness, so if man speaks that language, what is primary in that person? It's his godliness. It's his soul, which initially was the intention of creation.
So in some, it would be like the purity of that language, right? Coming through these people, they'd like be in agreement. They wouldn't be like dissing each other, smacking each other on the head with shovels and stuff like that at that point. They're all in agreement because they're all united. Okay, there's no division yet. Okay, no other languages given them to cause confusion or make them speak in Babel, right? Okay. So yeah, all intentions would have been good. Is that what he's saying? Like he might pass, the guy might say, "Can you pass the hammer, please?" So he goes, "Oh, sure, brother." And gives him the hammer. And now the guy goes, "Thank you very much. You're so kind." You know, talk like that, right? Because they all had these one mind, one consciousness, and it was all pure holiness, etc. Is that what he's getting at?
Of the tree of knowledge, what was the thrust of his value? The thrust of his value was his spirituality, because he went and ingested the tree of knowledge, the fruit, which is unadulterated evil. He became totally confused and diminished and limited. But he still spoke the language. So all humanity still spoke the language. That means they still had that spark of holiness within them, and therefore the perspective was similar. They may have been off, but the perspective there's still relevance to understanding who God is. Whether they want to submit to him, that's a different story. Submit is a different issue.
Okay, so it continues on from there. So we are going to compare this Lashon HaKodesh with the Aramaic translator Victor Alexander's translation of the original language that God spoke, the Lshana Ateeqa of the Ktav Ivri. We're going to have a look at that. Okay, and his notes on it from his website. We actually found this, some really interesting stuff before that. Okay, we just got to find it again. Okay, here it says the Asherai were moreover Aramaic speaking Semites, and barriers of race and language were virtually non-existent between them and their Jewish brethren in the Holy City. The Asherai naturally gravitated to the eastern side, and so forth. Okay, that was something that we found interesting. Okay, yeah, maybe that was just it. Okay, we can't remember if there's anything else here that we found of interest. Probably should have highlighted it. Okay, as we said in other videos, as pathetic as it sounds, most Asherai do not know or recognise their own extensive history. There's even a strange mistrust of Asherai scholars. Anyone who writes on their history from amongst their nation at one time or another is accused of selling out the people, right? Okay, yeah, because we came across a Syrian, very nice, and he said to us they don't like talking about their history. When we asked, "Can you tell us about your Syrian history?" He says, no, we hate our history, we don't like it, and he didn't want to talk about it, right? Okay. Maybe also because other people would jump on it and start throwing crap at it, or whatever reasons he had. Okay, so we left that alone, and we're still trying to seek people who will actually do that. But if they don't like to talk about their history, well, you can't force them, to do that for you. Okay. Trying to find anything else on here that jumped out at us. Okay. Okay, here's the thing about the Asherai Church. The Church of the East goes back to the time of our Lord Jesus Christ. One of the last kings of an Asherai city-state during the Christian era, King Abgar, sent for Jesus to come to a city to cure him of leprosy. Jesus, as said, replied of his inability to go to him personally, but later sent 2 of his disciples to cure the king of his affliction. So his king or his son. Yeah, there's 2 versions of this apparently. It was his son that had some leprosy or whatever, and he wanted him healed. When this was accomplished, the king ordered his entire kingdom to convert to Christianity. The Church of the East still commemorates this event in its liturgy. Okay? And there's a lot of people out there, theologians, etc., that say, oh, this letter doesn't exist. Or it does, but there's very little of it, or some other person has made a note of it in their history. They're telling of the history, and they speak about this King Abgar the Black, probably of Edessa. Okay, it's talking about Henry Layard that discovered the Great Library of Nineveh, an archaeological dig, him and his assistant, Razam or some name like that, right? And shipped 50,000 tablets to the British Museum. They're sitting there today. Okay. However, Asherai have been known as Nestorians, Chaldeans, Nestorian Chaldeans, as Layard calls them, occasionally dropping the designation of Nestorian. East Syrian, as Aziz is Atiyah, refers to them sometimes as Syriac-speaking or Aramaic-speaking people. Surayeh, as sometimes the Asherai themselves call each other, succumbing to the confusion which has been created as a result of various political theories, policies, or histories concerned with the many religious designations of the Asherai nation. Because Nestorian, they're erroneously called the Nestorian Church because Nestorius had a debate with Cyril, a Roman Catholic, and he said that he came up with the hypostasis, right? He said that Jesus, or the Christ, was of 2 substances, 2 natures, both divine and man. Cyril didn't like this, and he was jealous because he wanted to be the bishop of all bishops, but he felt that Nestorius would be, right? So he started creating all these lies about him, and then they were called, because this church agreed with that hypostasis that he had, story that he came out with, right, of Christ having 2 substances, of being of 2 natures, both God or divine and man, because they said they later on that they had been saying that, or believed that, whatever, thousands of years before Nestorius uttered it, they were labelled Nestorians. The Nestorian Church erroneously, okay, to a point where someone in an interview with the Patriarch kept saying Nestorian. So he says, look, if you keep saying Nestorian, we're going to have to go to war. But they've basically taken it on and accepted it because that's the title that was bestowed upon him, even though it was erroneous. He's not the founder of their church. Okay, so they got persecutions, called heretics, for 18 centuries or 2,000 years of crap, right, by the Roman Catholics, probably the Protestants, Tamerlane, Genghis Khan and the Mongols, ISIS, the Kurds, Al-Qaeda, etc., etc. Okay, so we're going to go to the next one because we can't see what jumped out at us earlier. Anything else there? Yeah, and further translator notes. This is Victor N. Alexander, translator from Bet Naharain, or Mesopotamia, Syria, with 15 years experience. And he states one of the early ideas he had regarding the translation of the Bible was to avoid reading the existing Bible translations thoroughly before translating. He did not wish the translations from the Greek or Latin verses to influence him. He wanted a fresh impression as much as was possible. He attempted to suppress the wordings and phraseology that had crept into his subconscious. He had to guard against unconscious inclusions of wordings from other translations. Having attended many church services since childhood, and his reading of the Bible over the years could make his translation a difficult task. One of the mistakes that he made at the very beginning was assuming that the Syriac translation of the Peshitta, that would be the Eastern Syriac Peshitta, was an authentic work of translating. This misconception set him back about 1.5 years. At first the mistake depressed him, but later it turned out to be an unexpected benefit. He became familiar with the evolution of the Aramaic language. He had already translated the Gospels of Mark and Matthew in that order. Then he had a conversation one day with an old Church of the East priest. He told him that Victor N. Alexander, that he'd been translating the Bible from Syriac, Victor N. Alexander had told this high priest that he had been translating the Bible from Syriac into English for the sake of sharing the authentic Aramaic Bible with his American friends and English-speaking people. At this time he did not say very much except for smiling what he thought was approval. At a later meeting, the high priest asked him what he was doing. He said that he was still translating the Bible. Then the high priest had to tell him, Victor N. Alexander, he said, the Syriac is all wrong. Talk about being shocked. Victor N. Alexander had just finished translating Matthew and was getting ready to translate John. He had already translated Mark before he met the high priest that priest for the first time from that original apostolic Church of the East. He asked him, this is Victor N. Alexander asking that priest, wasn't the Syriac translated from the ancient tongue? The Church of the East is an Asherite church. And we do not use the term Aramaic. They don't refer to themselves as Assyrian, but Asherite. And we do not use the term Aramaic. This is a Western designation, or name allocated to it, right? Aramaic really evolved from the language of the Asherite, the people of Mesopotamia. This priest said, no, the Syriac version was translated by the Protestants and Catholics from the Greek versions. Then Victor N. Alexander asked him, still incredulous, you mean no one has translated the ancient tongue original at all? The priest said no. Then he purchased a copy of the official Church of the East New Testament book from him, and he began reading Mark and later Matthew, and he was amazed it was different. And that's why when you look at on YouTube at Victor N. Alexander's explanation of his translation of the original Aramaic Brita, or known as Genesis in English, you'll find that he's reading from what looks like a Bible in a funny language, right? That's that Aramaic, possibly the Ninevite Aramaic, because he's used a method to revive that old dead language, and he's speaking that. He's reading to you and translating it into English for all his viewers. Okay, that's the one he's talking about, that he got from the high priest, right? Okay, it's erroneously called Adam, or wrongly called Adam and Eve, but it should be Adam and Eve. Yeah. Or just put in the Aramaic scriptures in your YouTube search, and you'll find it. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. So that's that native-born Aramaic-speaking translator from Mesopotamia, Syria. 15 years experience in translating those particular scriptures, Victor N. Alexander. His middle name is Nimrod, not Isaac, as one person, Bennett, on his blog site tried to say that he said. Could have been hospitalized at the time and made a mistake, but I doubt it, because throughout his website he stresses that his grandfather or great-grandfather or someone was in his family was called Nimrod, so that's his middle name, and they can trace it back to the actual Nimrod of the Bible, as well as the Jews that came out of Exodus, right? They were liberated from Egypt, etc. So he can trace that, apparently. Okay, so this was all these scriptures weren't translated from the ancient tongue originally, right? So this high priest, or this priest, said no. So he purchased a copy of the official Church of the East New Testament book from him, and he began reading Mark and later Matthew. He was amazed it was different, and he started to retranslate it, right? It took him a while to recover emotionally. He had spent 1.5 years of his time translating the two Gospels from what he thought was the authentic Aramaic transcription into modern Syriac. Then he found out that he had been translating from a 19th century Syriac translation of what he finally determined was really a Syriac translation of mostly an English version. This 1897 Syriac version that he had was translated in Urmi, Iran, by American and English missionaries with the help of proselytized Asherite Christians, because they went in there, right, with their King James and converted a lot of these people, to their form of Western Christianity, right? So they became Christians. But what they tried to do was to try to translate that King James Version into Syriac, as we mentioned in other videos, and they totally messed it up. They botched it, right? So Victor and Alexander studied the work and activities of the missionaries to Urmi from around about 1839. He made some interesting discoveries. The Church of the East, being impoverished and its people barely surviving under Islamic oppression of the crumbling Ottoman Empire, had allowed the missionaries to enter their villages in North Iran and southeast Turkey. They preached to them their modern religions, their Western Christianity, their pseudo-Christianity. The missionaries from the West came in and established schools and churches and medical facilities. That's what they do when they see that need. That's what they do. Okay, that's what the Seventh-day Adventists are all about as well. Their movement, providing those hospital, medical facilities and churches. Here they have a business that's run by them, owned by them, by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, called I think they call it here Sanitarium. They do cornflakes and all that sort of stuff, right? After that guy who, I've forgotten his name, but it might have been Kellogg. Yeah, that was his name, Kellogg. They might be doing Kellogg cornflakes or some similar type of cornflake, right? Because my stepfather went there to get a job, and he ended up walking out and throwing their job application form in the rubbish, because they first said, "Oh, you are Seventh-day Adventist," and he's a proud Englishman, right? Church of England, me, mate, you know, all that sort of stuff. And then they asked him, he reckons they asked him some questions on the form. When's the last time did you have sex? You involved yourself in a sexual activity? You know, and he says, I just walked out and chucked it in the rubbish, and he got another job somewhere else in a warehouse, working for a warehouse, a popular warehouse here. Right? That guy had so much talent, skill, mouth-wise, that he could like quit one job and go and work in the job next door, in the business next door. That's how talented he was. That's why I admired him for that. Okay, because he had that ability to do that. Okay, the missionaries from the West came in and established schools and churches and medical facilities. They learned the Syriac Aramaic vernacular, a modern version of it, right? And wrote up a grammar for the people. As a result, everyone could now read the Bible in the modern vernacular, which until then only priests of the Church of the East knew how to read. The ancient Aramaic scripture was passed down to them from the apostolic age. So all these people out there that boast, oh, I know it better than him. When he says the Lord's Prayer, he says Avun or Abun or something. That's all wrong. He doesn't know. I know it because I went to a biblical college or institution or whatever, and I got this pretty little certificate that says I'm an expert, right? Go figure. You can speak it better than a guy who speaks it fluently? Wow, you're an Einstein. Okay, the Church of the East had retained the ancient Aramaic in their liturgy when celebrating Mass and conducting official church services. The Bible itself was read in the original ancient Aramaic during church services. The priests explained it to them in the modern Aramaic vernacular, okay, probably that Syriac or whatever, through brief sermons. By this date, there were no major theologians left. So, with the originals, they didn't have to translate it and translate it into other foreign languages like Greek, Latin, or whatever, right? Because it was basically for the people who spoke the same language. They understood it, they wrote it, whatever, right? Who attended their mass or their church, right? So these high priests or these priests, they just read it to them, right? Explained it to them, and they grasped it. See, there were no major Asherai or Assyrian Church of the East theologians left. In comparison, the Catholic Church has always had priests that knew Latin. The Church of the East priests of this period did not know ancient Aramaic that well. However, the Catholic Latin version was a translation of the Greek, which is itself by definition a translation of the words of Jesus Christ spoken in ancient Aramaic. So what these Catholics have got is a Latinized version of the Greek. In contrast, the Church of the East at least had the original ancient Aramaic scriptures hand copied without any changes from the original tongue. Judging by the thousands of idioms that only make complete sense in the Aramaic, there is no doubt as to the origin of the ancient Aramaic New Testament. The Church of the East ancient Aramaic New Testament is the original gospel of Jesus Christ. All others are translations. The Church of the East schools, etc., etc. And there's more here. He decided to carry on his translation independently of all denominations. The ecumenical movement is somewhat responsible for a superficial solidarity among the denominations involved with it. The established churches do not see any need for a new English language translation. Okay, and he resumed his work of his translation after all those considerations. Okay, he's got some more there. And there's the reason why he's not used the Logos as Andrew Gabriel Roth has in his translation of the Eastern Syriac Peshitta into English at the AramaicScriptures.com. Okay, he hasn't used the Greek word Logos, or the word in English. Okay. He opened up John and started reading the ancient Aramaic of this gospel for the first time, and he was awed by it. Here was a clear view of the triune God from the very beginning of the first chapter. The key word was milta, a beautiful word in its theological connotation, and there was no English equivalent for it, so I had to run around and find one in the English that matched it, right, that fit it. Logos and word are such poor substitutes. There is essentially no English translation for the word milta, as we just stated, in a theological sense. Therefore, he had to come up with one. So he translated the word milta as manifestation. Jesus Christ is God manifest, God incarnated in the flesh, right? There is one God. But, or yet, there are three manifestations, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That's what makes it triune. There's a difference between the triune of the Mesopotamian, that concept, etc., right, and its meaning, and the Christian understanding of their Trinity, which comes from supposedly a Roman or someone like that called Tertullian. Okay, he had this idea of the Trinity. So there's a difference here. Someone the other day, a Christian, said no, it didn't come from him. Go do your research to find out where that Christian concept, the Trinity, comes from, right? Okay, so Victor and Alexander translated John and then Luke, and then finally went back to Matthew and started fresh, and then at that point he's translating Mark. And you see, he kept posting translations until he has all the New Testament down pat. Then he would start with the Old Testament. He never completed the whole lot because he, being older man, he had some medical problems and all that sort of stuff. But hopefully he's all right now. As far as we know, he came out of the hospital after 56 days, and that's all we know. Okay, so here's about Urmi, the country he was talking about, or that area in Mesopotamia he was talking about. There's a great history here of them, etc. And not too sure if there's anything here that jumped out at us. Okay, here we go. Here's one here. One can easily make a case for the presentation of the history of the Ashuri as a religious lesson of biblical proportions for mankind, considering the Ashuri as martyrs of Christendom. Ancient Ashur was the handiwork of God and the scepter in his hand. Not only did he guide the Jewish people, but also the Ashuri nation. When the Ashuri sinned against him, he turned away from them. As he did with the Israelites, right? He turned their back on them. Okay, so God's prophecy apparently in Scripture was, if you turned away from me, there'll be repercussions. I'll send the Babylonians to conquer you, etc., etc., and you'll be no more. Something like that, right? And then all went over to the tribe of Judah. Okay, God turned to the tribe of Judah apparently, and then they ended up doing the same. They were forgiven. After 10 years, they're forgiven, and then they did it again, and then they're forgiven, and they did it again. Kept doing it. So God gets really upset with both of them, right? In this sense, right? He gets upset with both of them. So he says to them, right, I'm going to send, we're pretty sure it was the Assyrians, to come and conquer you, and invade you and conquer you, and you may not be anymore. Something like that along those lines, right? Go look at the scriptures, right? Okay, so not only did he guide the Jewish people, but also the Ashuri nation. When the Ashuri sinned against him, he turned away from them. When they did his will, he blessed them. He brought Abraham out of their fold to create the Hebrew nation. Yeah, he was a Chaldean, maybe of Jewish origin, but he was born in Ur of Chaldea, or Chaldea, Babylonia, right? What they call Babylonia. So he brought Abraham out of their fold to create the Hebrew nation. The Avri, that's what it means in the Aramaic, the ancient Aramaic. People who crossed over rivers, right, or passage. Yeah. He commanded Abraham to send Isaac to Mesopotamia to marry a believer in the true God. Subsequently, he commanded Jacob to do the same. Our Lord Jesus Christ's lineage is from Asher, according to the Bible. The Asherite nation was sent the prophet Jonah to Nineveh, right, to remind them of God's place in their empire, because this wrath was going to come upon them because of their pagan idol worship and all this sort of stuff. And later, throughout their Christian history, God made the Asherite people live as Christian martyrs. Okay, they suffered when because apparently this king heard all that Jonah said, and he says, look people, right, this is the one true God. I've realised it. Let's go around and smash all these idols, Ashtaroth pole or whatever it was, maypole, all this other stuff. Put on sackcloth, throw dust all over ourselves, even the animals, and repent, turn to the one true God of this guy Jonah, right? And then he wrote all down in cuneiform, but apparently underneath that cuneiform, this Victor Alexander found, we went to the different museums or whatever, looked at those artifacts, he found there was Aramaic, right? So he translated that as part of his translation project, right? Okay, so the Asherite nation was sent the prophet Jonah to remind them of God's place in their empire. And later, throughout their Christian history, God made the Asherite people live as Christian martyrs. The Asherite people have suffered all their lives for the cause of Christendom. They are the living apostles of Jesus Christ, and they should be regarded by all Christians as such. And their trials and tribulations should be a lesson to be studied by all the churches of the world. Perhaps history is the final lesson for the unification of Christians of the whole world. Otherwise, how did the Asherites survive against impossible odds if it wasn't the will of the Lord? Yeah, they should basically be wiped out. Consider their plight in the outset of WW1. With a very difficult and unexpected route, the Asherites made their way to Persia, where they expected to join the Russian allies. They fought many battles on the way, and so forth. Okay, so yeah, having 2,000 years of persecution, being called heretics, a lot of their people being killed through massacres and genocide, martyred, deprivation, etc. By all logic and common sense, they should have been wiped out, right? Even today, when there have been different parts of Iran, etc., different tribes, different people, with their beliefs are getting attacked, killed, treated as slaves by these different factions, extremist Islamic factions, all that sort of stuff, right? This nation and those of that North Iran or Iran should have been wiped out altogether, right? They've lost their land, everything. They still love their land and all that sort of stuff. Want it back, they'd love to have it back, go back, and all this sort of stuff, but there's that danger there, right? So they've migrated to other places like America and the West, right? And then they're in peace and safety, whatever, to practice their old religion, right? Etc. etc. Okay. They, the Asherites, had deliberately and in the face of great temptation and danger thrown in their lot what they believed to be the right way. They had seen themselves abandoned by those who had urged them in this course, and yet had stood by it and had defended themselves against tremendous odds in a very creditable way. Though beaten from their country, at last they conducted an orderly retreat in the face of immense difficulties, and brought with them not only their women but their flocks and herds as well. They arrived in Persia in November 1915, in northwest of modern-day Iran. The mountain Asherai of Turkey joined their plainsmen brethren army, and so forth. Okay, there's this plan to wipe them out. There's this agenda to wipe them out totally. Why is that? Because, like Christ said, to the Pharisees, those people of that generation that he was preaching to, he says, something like this foolish generation or silly generation asks for miraculous signs, all that sort of stuff, blah blah blah. And he says that the men of Nineveh shall rise or be resurrected on Judgment Day and judge those particular people in his day, who he was preaching to in that era, right? He will judge them, right? Because they are like the ones who totally stuck with it, right? It's like he's foretelling the future. They'll be the ones that totally stuck with it, stayed faithful. So, as honorary people, they'd rise and they'll be pointing the finger at those ones that were given these Mosaic laws, etc., etc., but they're perverting them, because they were pompous, puffed up. They loved the authority, they loved the prestige, trumpets blown when they walk down the street announcing their arrival. They get to sit in the best places at gatherings. They have the finest food, all that sort of stuff, right? And people, make up their bee's knees as they do with their offshoots today. Okay, the personal congratulations of the Tsar, that would be the Russian Tsar, were sent to Mar Benjamin Shamun, the patriarch of the Esrite, who visited Tiflis to receive high decorations from the Grand Duke Nicholas himself. The Mar Shamun family produced patriarchs for the Esrite for 600 years. It is ironic that high decorations of a Tsar, or Russian Tsar, are considered noteworthy of mention, but it's indicative of the impoverished and weakened state of the Esrite at the turn of the 20th century. Still, the Assyrian nation was holding its own and existing as a corporate body politic in the land, and it continued to do so until the autumn of 1917, when the unmistakable signs of complete collapse began to show themselves in Russia and aroused well-grounded anxiety and so forth. Yeah. So to this very day, these people of that church, the revised apostolic church, the modern church, right? Church of the East, are still clinging to the old religion, their old traditions, their rituals, their rites, etc., from over 2,000 years ago, even though they've been persecuted between those, from that point for 2,000 years and so forth. They're still sticking to it, right? They've never wavered. Okay, Asher religious perspective. Although the Asherite people were the very first humans who believed in the one true God, the very first humans being who believed in the one true God. Okay, I'll read it again. Although the Asherite people were the very first human beings who believed in the one true God, whom they named Asher, hence in Exodus, especially in the Aramaic, Lshana Ateeqa, translated in English, it says, you shall go tell these house of Israel, those who are in bondage in Egypt, my people, my name, because Moses asked, well, okay, God, they're going to ask me at some point, what's his name? What name did he give you? We want to know, right? So he says, will you tell them that this is my name that they're going to use forever, okay, to the end of time, all eternity, whatever. And it's part of it, the commemorative memorial of him, right? When they come to honour him and all that sort of stuff, right? And it was Ahiyah Asher Asher Hiyah, right? Which means I am the one who is coming, etc., etc. Right? We've done that, covered that in another video, right? And that's what it meant, and they were told that that's what they would call him to the end of time, right? These particular people that he liberated from Egypt. Okay, so read again. Although the Asherite people were the first human beings who believed in the one true God, whom they named Asher, they have lost their identity and role in modern times. While the world is groping for a new faith to sustain their technological growth, no one seems to remember just what the significance of that first faith in Asher represents. Okay, a lot of the Western theologians, the church, etc., want to blot them out for their different reasons. They've got their hidden motives, agenda, and so forth, right, to establish themselves as the all-time truth, the number one at the top of the ladder, right? And having no opposition, no opposite, or nothing, that can contest against them, and so forth. No competition in fact, and no competition in sum, right? There is a widespread belief among today's Western Christians that the worship of Asher was a pagan religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. In other words, it's a load of rubbish, right? Okay. There is a widespread belief among today's Western Christians that the worship of Asher was a pagan religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yet the beleaguered churches are so afraid of the true knowledge of the true God and the true faith that they are brainwashing their congregations. Here you go. They're brainwashing their congregations against any new knowledge that merely clarify and bolster the word of the Scripture. that may clarify and bolster the word of the scripture. So much so that even the Asherite churches themselves are keeping their own members in the dark regarding the role the Church of the East played in the growth of early Christianity. That would be like the Chaldean and etc., all these Orthodox ones. The name, who are clinging to the Roman Catholic Church, right? The name Asher is synonymous with the word God. Asher is the name the first people who settled in Mesopotamia called the monotheistic. That was the one God, right? One and only God, whom they came to worship, because they only knew of God. They knew of God, but they'd never seen God face to face, right? Because there's that scripture, if you looked upon the face of God, you would die. No human could withstand the glory, the purity of God. They'd just die, right? On the spot. Okay? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a one God. Okay? And that's all. So you can go, oh no, there's no other members of the Godhood, all that sort of stuff, right? Okay? Monotheistic could also unknowingly be pointing to the triune. Okay? That there is one God, yet he's triune. That could be what it's pointing at. Unbeknown to some, or many, whom they came to worship. The name Asher comes to us from a cuneiform name which was based on a pictograph of the concept. Okay? It was based on a pictograph of the concept. That's like a drawing, right? Before language, right? You had the oral, then you had the pictographs, okay, like scribbles or whatever, of the concept of a single deity that was almighty and omniscient, above all physical reality, in the sole seat of the spiritual world that humankind could fathom. Why would they say there's only that one God? Because they knew of God, but they'd never seen God, but they didn't know of the manifestation of God, the Multa, who dwelled in the midst of God. He was his companion, present with him, etc., etc. Okay, because it wasn't yet revealed to them. Okay? Or, as we know today, it appears that no, it couldn't be. Okay? Because in the Old Testament it wasn't revealed to him, in your Americanized Bible versions, in English, etc., etc. Okay, but when you look at this supposed ancient original Aramaic sacred scribal old tongue language of God, translation into English, you'll find in many places like Exodus, God was talking to Moses, and someone else was talking to Moses. Supposedly this Multa was actually with Moses and guiding him, right, while walking around on the earth, right? He's actually present, etc., etc. Okay, he's spoken of this Christ to come. This Messiah was spoken of throughout the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, right, when he turned up. Okay. So he was prophesied, right? But many deny it and say, no, according to our scriptures, there's no mention of him, possibly because they, as it's supposedly said, they blotted his name out. He who shall not be spoken of, etc., etc. The bastard son of Mary and Joseph, the illegitimate, who claimed to be the Son of God, or God himself, or whatever, the blasphemer, all that sort of stuff, right? Okay? Because there's a certain faction, or factions that don't want, mention of him, acknowledgement of him. Okay, so the name Asher is synonymous with the word God. Asher is the name of the first people who settled in Mesopotamia called the monotheistic God, whom they came to worship. The name Asher comes to us from the cuneiform name which was based on a pictograph of the concept of a single deity that was almighty and omniscient, above all physical reality, in the sole seat of the spiritual world that humankind could fathom. So would that be the same in the Hebrew? They had pictographs. Would that say exactly the same? Well, near enough to it, right? So there's a video by a Dutch Uncle John, the Exodus of Genesis or something like that, the origins of Genesis, and a few others that delve into that pictographs in the Hebrew, and came up with the same understanding. Okay, some might say, oh, but they're Messianic Jews, blah blah blah, all this whatever excuses, right? But that's what they'll come up with. Dutch Uncle John and a couple of other probably Messianic Jew rabbis or whatever they were, and they say, according to these pictographs, this means the owner of the tent, and this means the keeper of the tent, which is referring to that Messiah, and that he died. It's prophesied at that Genesis 1 verse 1 onwards, in regards to those pictographs, that this certain being, the keeper of the tent, because remember God's the owner of the tent, and this one was the keeper of the tent, right? He's the safeguarder of it. He will die by his own hand, okay, by his own will sacrifice, however it's put, right? He will die upon this cross by his own hand, willingly be the sacrifice, right? I.e., that sacrifice 4,000 years later or whatever, of a certain date, for the remission of man's sin, the remission of man's sins through the shedding of his blood, by his stripes, all that sort of Christian New Testament stuff, right? Okay, so that's a prophecy because it happened. Okay, but a lot of these rabbis, etc., deny that. Say, no, it doesn't say that. That's a messianic making things up or whatever they come up with, right? But what if the person wasn't messianic? What if he was like someone like Rabbi Reuben, that in his video looking at the book of Revelations said, well, this is the reason why 1920s, 1930s Berlin was the city of desolation, etc., and it matches what Victor Alexander's book of Revelation states, that in the 1930s, etc., it was prophesied, it had been prophesied before, right, that there was a certain city of desolation, and it matches with what Rabbi Reuben is saying, that a certain faction that owned all the banks and whatever, caused a high rise in interest rates, personal loans. You couldn't pay it back because of the inflation, right? Like if you had a loan, you'd have to pay back about 80% interest and all this sort of stuff. You couldn't buy bread, just the everyday loaf of bread. You could pull up with a cartload of Reichsmarks or German dollars to pay for a loaf of bread, and they'd say, well, no, you're a couple of dollars short because the price just went up because of inflation and all this sort of stuff. The loan paybacks were 80 to 88%, so it made it impossible for people to pay it back. Okay, they were the cause of a great rise in sodomy, prostitution, and so forth. Okay, so according to possibly Mein Kampf or Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Struggle, that book, right? He says, this is the reason why he started to do what he did, because it was ruining Germany's economy. They were starving, unemployed, all that sort of stuff. So it took him 6 years to sort that out, which he did, right? It took him 6 years. Okay, but then he went all silly because it was bully boys. They were sort of sadistic. If you have a look at the history behind them of those people, like Goebbels, just look at the guy. Himmler, look at that guy. They're all like, they look like they're sadistic, right? I don't know about Goering, but they look kind of sadistic. They definitely look sadistic, right? And history again proves that that's what they were. They were the bully boys. Hitler would say something, and then they'd say, "Oh yeah, but if you do it this way, okay, eradicate the problem altogether by using this suggestion, this solution, okay, that'll fix the problem." And say Hitler coming to that point, says, "Yeah, okay, well, we don't have the transport to ship them to Palestine to make them work for us to build up our war effort. Okay, that would build up our economy, all that sort of stuff. Okay," and he went with it, right? And that's the proper history. Okay, we're not Hitler lovers or enthusiasts, so they come at us with that. It's just what history and your Rabbi Reuben is actually pointing at, right? Actually saying, as well as the book of Revelation from the Aramaic Galilean, translated in English. Okay, because there's a history, his story, right? When the people are victorious, the ones that win the war, they tell their story of how they were victorious. They conquered this guy, that guy, whatever, right? They put the downfall, but they leave out what actually went on, the real history, right? According to what actually went down, the hidden secret motives they had, the agenda that talks behind the backs, different factions, different political leaders, and what they were really all about, right? They give you this false front. This is how it was, and then you get taught it in your schools, your universities. This is how it was. Oh, poor, all this sort of stuff. Okay, and then because apparently this lot asked for, rightfully, asked for remuneration, right, for those crimes. But sometimes when you look at it, it's like these people are second or third generation after the fact, right? They're asking for monetary reparations from the US or whatever, 3 generations after the event, right? Supposedly, that's according to different claims, studies, whatever that you might come across. Okay, yeah. So yeah, we're not Nazi lovers or Hitler lovers or promoters or anything like that. Just what we have found through personal research. Okay, it's up to you to go see if we're speaking the truth or talking a whole lot of doo-doo, right? Everyone has their own opinion, their understanding, their perspectives, their views, their ego, okay, what they believe, they strongly believe in, and many times they try to crush you because of that, right? But anyway, that's basically that. Oh, here we go, here's another one here, right? The name Asher is synonymous with the word God. Asher is the name of the first people who settled in Mesopotamia called the monotheistic God whom they came to worship. The name Asher comes to us from a cuneiform name which was based on the pictograph of the concept of a single deity that was almighty and omniscient and above all physical reality and the sole seat of the spiritual world that humankind could fathom or understand. In Chariots of the Gods, the book by Eric von Daniken, there was talk of aliens having come to the planet Earth and populated it with humanoids. As proof of the alien landing, he used aerial photographs that showed landing markers or designs that could only be seen from above the Earth. Zechariah Sitchin uses distortions of cuneiform text to fabricate similar stories of alien landings. Both writers placed the date of these landings hundreds of thousands of years ago to fit in with modern evolution theory dates. Victor E. Alexander states he might add. Also, gene splicing is claimed by both of them. The so-called winged bulls of Asher are again indications as proof of genetic experiments, etc. That's what this Sitchin, etc. is saying. Juxtaposing these two writers' points of view with the Greek and Western theologians' interpretations of scriptures shows us how this history and religion of Asher are distorted for the purpose of gaining an ancient and authentic knowledge through a denial of the origin of the civilization that produced that knowledge. Daniken and Sitchin claim that the legends of Mesopotamia are records of aliens, and that guy in History of Alien, History Channel, Alien Conspiracy, all that stuff, that guy George Snuffleupagus or whatever with the big hair, messy hair, tries to say that as well. Daniken and Sitchin claim that the legends of Mesopotamia are records of aliens. George Snuffleupagus, I think it's like Theropopoulos or something like that. Mesopotamia are records of aliens from other galaxies, and the Western theologians claim that the religion of Asher is mythology.